And it's one that perhaps Canadian society struggles to deal with. I mean, certainly for the most part, I think we want to come down on the side of freedom of religion. But where are the limits to that? One of the flashpoints for that debate has been around the kirpan, a ceremonial dagger worn by some Sikhs. Now, what happened this week is that in Quebec, at Quebec's National Assembly, there were some hearings taking place on the whole question of religious freedom and reasonable accommodation and cultural and religious practices of minorities. And so 4 representatives of the World Sikh organization were scheduled to address that committee. Problem was that they were not allowed into the Quebec National Assembly because security said that their ceremonial daggers would pose a problem. Now, they had received conflicting responses as to whether that would be a problem, but when they arrived, security guards gave them the option to put the kirpan in a safe place. They refused and were denied entry. Well, this issue has now been taken up. The Bloc Québécois has taken up the mantle federally. The Bloc Québécois says the time has come to ban the kirpan from the House of Commons and that this rule should apply on Parliament Hill as well. Now, this would apply to at least one Member of Parliament, Liberal MP Navdeep Bains, wears the kirpan in the House of Commons. Now, he's obviously quite upset at how the Bloc Québécois has pounced on this issue, made an issue of it federally. Obviously, security on Parliament Hill does not object to Navdeep Bains wearing a kirpan. It is ceremonial, but it is, or potentially is, a weapon. There was a story last year in Toronto. Here's the story as it appeared in the Toronto Star. The crowd of about 150 people was yelling obscenities and threats outside the Sikh Lehar Centre in Brampton when 3 temple officials stepped out to pacify them. Within seconds, one in the crowd, clutching a thick steel bangle, punched Manjit Mangat, the president of the Sikh temple, in the face. Witnesses say at least 2 men brandished unsheathed kirpans. In the next moment, Mangat was on the ground, his face bloodied, and a 5-inch wound in his abdomen. Any weapon could have been used in the attack, but the fact that it was a kirpan alarms Sikh leaders who fear the incident will rouse objections once again over one's right to wear the religious symbol in public. Well, joining us for some thoughts on all of this, we're very pleased to welcome to the program Palbinder Shergill, General Legal Counsel for the World Sikh Organization of Canada. Palbinder, good to talk to you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Rob, and good evening to all your listeners in Alberta.
All right. Well, I'm sure you're used to discussing this issue. As I say, it's come up many times in the past. But what do you make of the way it's come about this time, what happened in Quebec and what the Bloc Québécois is doing in Ottawa?
Well, Rob, just to begin and give everyone a little bit of a background, the Sikh community holds a very unique position amongst the groups that were invited to make representations before the Commission. The Sikh religion as a cornerstone holds the equality between men and women, and as a result, specifically forbids the veiling of women. However, the Sikh religion also supports the right of freedom of religion, and it was as a consequence of the World Sikh Organization's mandate to stand up for the rights of others to freely practice their faith that this delegation, in fact, was scheduled to make representations before the Commission on that day. And it's unfortunate that the events happened as they did. The delegation only came to their minds, in fact, about a day before the hearing that they were scheduled to appear, that there might be an issue. They contacted several individuals and were being given conflicting information. They were advised at the outset that there would be no problem attending as long as the kirpan was securely fastened and they would be permitted entry. But unfortunately, that was not the case when they ultimately arrived.
So they felt as though they were kind of misled in a way.
Well, I think that perhaps we still don't know what the reason was. We still don't know who the individual or the person in charge was that made that decision. But quite clearly, it was unfortunate because it in fact took the debate away from a really critical issue that needs to be discussed in public, and that is the issue about freedom of faith. The right of a Muslim woman to practice her faith is something that I think is important. Whether we're Christian or Sikh or Hindu or Muslim or Jewish, we have to be able to understand and tolerate other people's belief systems. And it's unfortunate that the last few days have really taken, us away from that debate into a very different one.
Well, you're right. It has. I mean, I think, with the debate over the veil, the question has come up, well, where do we or where would we draw the line? Someone is free to wear the veil if that's what they choose, and it's not for us to know whether it's a free choice. We have to assume that it is. But when it comes to teaching in a school, when it comes to providing a government service, is there a point at which we can say, look, I mean, that freedom ends there because your role for the state requires, in this case, you to show your face. So there's a debate to be had around that. Now, the Kirpan is different, but does it present some of the same issues, you think?
Well, in a different way, and I think and I want to give your listeners a fuller perspective, and perhaps the irony won't be lost on you when I explain it this way. The word Kirpan means magnanimity or grace, and the Kirpan for a Sikh represents their obligation as citizens of society to stand up for the rights of others, to really represent and defend the defenseless. And it's a spiritual article of faith, and the irony is that it's that very mandate that comes from this Kirpan that really was the reason why the Sikh community, in fact, felt it necessary to make submissions at this inquiry, and in fact, ultimately became the reason that they were prevented from being able to do so. So it is really ironic. But the debate, in my view, was settled. It was settled uncategorically in a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court of Canada. 8 judges in our highest court in this country unanimously considered this several years ago when they issued the decision regarding the young schoolboy that was attending school in Quebec, and came to the conclusion that the Kirpan was not a weapon, that it was not dangerous, that it did not pose a security risk. And despite that, and despite subsequently the 2010 Olympic Committee coming to the same decision, the Integrated Security Force, security unit, which of course is comprised of CSIS, of the RCMP, they all came to the conclusion that the Kirpan would not be a security threat at the highest security event that this country has held. And yet, for some reason, the National Assembly feels differently.
So this hasn't been an issue in any other legislature. Obviously, it's not an issue on Parliament Hill, and this has never come up as far as you're aware?
It has not come up before at all, and in fact, members of the public routinely go to Parliament Hill. They advise security. I've done that many times myself because, of course, men and women wear the Kirpan. And, security looks at the Kirpan and confirms that it's securely in place. And, of course, that's how it's worn by a Sikh. It's always worn securely underneath your clothing. It's always strapped in a fabric. And it is held very close to the body, and it is difficult for even the wearer to have access to it, let alone somebody else. But the issue has not arisen, and I believe Navdeep Bains, the MP that wears the Kirpan as well in Parliament, has said that he, in fact, has attended at the U.S. Congress and has been able to freely attend without any issue, and I've known many other people that have been able to do that as well.
Mm-hmm. What about air travel, though? I mean, air travel is still one area where it needs to be taken off. Is that still the case?
It is now. It wasn't like that pre-9/11. Post-9/11, the world has changed. And I think this is where the Sikh community and individuals also are willing and have met halfway. And that's really the question of reasonable accommodation. A reasonable Sikh understands that when they're boarding an airplane, the situation is very different. You're in a very, very small, confined environment with a number of other people. Security and safety is an extremely large concern. And just as many of us do not like the idea of body scans, and yet we're prepared to undergo those when we go to the airport. But if we were told that we had to go through body scans every time we walked into a coffee shop or, walked into a government building, we'd balk at that. And it's no different for a Sikh, particularly because the Kirpan itself was never intended and designed for use as a weapon. And so, to be able to freely wear that when an individual is participating in sort of normal courses in society is a pretty important issue for a Sikh.
Well, I mean, I mentioned the incident almost a year ago in Toronto, where one was used as a weapon. Now, I've never actually seen one in person. I've seen images of kirpans, pictures of kirpans. Some do look more like weapons with a sharp point. Others really have much more of a rounded point, not really particularly sharp. So, I mean, wouldn't some be? I mean, if they were not sheathed, wouldn't they look and seem like weapons?
Well, they have to be sheathed. So for a kirpan to be called a kirpan, it must have three elements. It has to be sheathed. It has to be kept in that fabric and tied on the fabric into the fabric belt and held and worn securely against the body. That element has got to exist. So when we see images of the kirpan, what we actually see are images of not the way that the kirpan is ever worn by a Sikh and, in fact, mandated to be worn. The incident in Brampton is a very unfortunate incident, and, criminal behavior is criminal behavior. If an individual, one individual does an unlawful act, then you cannot and should not be punishing everyone else and assuming that they are going to be committing an act as well. And I think, Rob, maybe the example that we can use, and certainly the example that often comes to mind, is that if I intend to use a weapon to harm somebody, then there are far more easily accessible items that are available to me. For example, of course, as a woman, I'm taught self-defense, and when I took my self-defense classes, one of the very first things I was taught was how to use a pair of car keys. And in order to inflict harm on someone if I was being attacked. Now, car keys are easy for me to access. They're in my purse. They're handy, and no one will ever suggest that when I go through security, I should hand over my car keys. And yet, we think that those have a utilitarian purpose. But for the non-Sikh, the kirpan does not seem to be, it's not seen for any utilitarian purpose. And I think that's partly the responsibility of the Sikh community. We haven't been able to educate people enough. We haven't been able to properly explain the issue in a way that makes sense. And I hope that part of this interview will be a step towards that.
Well, and I'll give you a chance to address that, because maybe the question I or others might have, well, okay, I mean, if it's a ceremonial dagger and we can understand why it's worn, what the point of it is it a requirement that it be metal? Is it a requirement that it be sharp? I mean, couldn't it be of different material or have a different tip to it? I mean, couldn't that be part of it?
The kirpan is an article of faith, and an article of faith has in itself, it in fact has to be integral as it is. It can't be. You can't have a symbolic representation as a part of the faith or a part of the religion. It's much like saying to a priest who wears a collar that why can't you simply carry around a photograph of the collar? What does it symbolize? The meaning to that individual goes far beyond what it may appear to the public. And again, asking for a symbolic representation of it really goes to the question of assuming that it is a weapon, or it's designed for use as a weapon, or it is easily usable as a weapon. But we have symbols in our society all the time. We've got, for example, the mace in the House of Commons, which is used, in ceremonies when the speaker comes in. Now, the mace, through centuries of history, has always been seen as an extraordinarily violent weapon, and yet we don't give it that symbolic reference at all. For an outsider who's not a Christian, the idea of communion, drinking the blood of Christ, or breaking bread, seems almost as if it is cannibalism. And yet, of course, for a Christian that's practicing their faith, it doesn't have that symbolic representation at all. And so part of this is really about cultural understanding, about being able to really be able to see what the meaning of an object is to another individual and what the internal restrictions are. If a Sikh misuses a kirpan, there's some very strong sanctions within the religion itself against that individual, in addition, of course, to criminal sanctions in society.
Well, Palbinder, we'll leave it there, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity again to talk more about this. But as you say, hopefully through all this discussion, people can at least understand the issues here. And we do appreciate you joining us tonight to do just that.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's been a pleasure speaking to you tonight.
Appreciate it. Palbinder Shergill is General Legal Counsel for the World Sikh Organization of Canada. Let's take a break here.